Alright, YouTube, we are back talking some Final Fantasy XVII. And I'm being legit when I say that because we are actually talking about Final Fantasy XVII. There's actually an interview with Naoki Yoshida, an Anime News Network, from a little over a week ago at this point. I've been aware of it. We're just waiting kind of to eventually talk about it. He's asked about, the next game, the course Expedition 33 turn-based combat bullshit. And he does actually straight up mention Final Fantasy XVII. I thought it was kind of crazy because I'm not sure how often they talk about the next Final Fantasy, just because 16 is not that old and it's still kind of coming out on other platforms and shit. So I just don't know how often they've talked about that. They've probably discussed like the next Final Fantasy in some way or whatever, but just kind of hearing one of like the main people at Square Enix mention Final Fantasy 17 is kind of interesting. There's also another quote making the rounds from the Baldur's Gate 3 publishing director, kind of giving his thoughts on them going back to more traditional Final Fantasy that I thought we'd kind of look at too. With the recent release of Final Fantasy XVI on Xbox and the launch of Switch 2, have Square Enix's future plans changed? Final Fantasy XVI was a launch exclusive on PS5, so we go fully multi-platform for future Final Fantasy titles. As you've seen in terms of the titles released from our Creative Studio 3, we announced that Final Fantasy Tactics Ivalice Chronicles will be releasing on September 30th multi-platform. It's safe to assume that we will strive for multi-platform release moving forward. Nothing really new there, right? We've been hearing about the multi-platform strategy for quite some time now, but it's always good to hear. Not that we need reiteration of it, I guess, but it's just always good to hear. It's one of those things that always makes me wonder. I think I bring it up every time we talk multi-platform. It's like, where would the series be right now if there wasn't exclusivity? Like, if they could have got day one back when Remake dropped, if it was on like, PC, PS4, Xbox One, if they could make it work on the Switch 1 as well, like, where would the franchise be currently, right? And even if these games don't do that well on Xbox, there's still, pretty big install base back then, something like 40, 50 million roughly or so, something like that back in 2020. And there maybe could have been some sort of Game Pass thing, whatever. Could have got people in on the ground floor of the Remake project, and obviously with the Switch 1, there's just a massive audience there. But even if, at the very least, just like day one, PS4 and PC would have been nice. Like, exclusivity shit that they did with PlayStation, like, I wonder how much that's been holding back the franchise, right? And that'll kind of come into something we'll talk about later with the Baldur's Gate 3 dev guy or whatever. There's a game called Clair Obscur Expedition 33 that has a lot of critical acclaim and successful sales. One of the things that stood out about the game was its turn-based combat. Expedition 33 was inspired by games like Final Fantasy and Persona. I know that you said in the past that Final Fantasy XVI's more action-based combat was sort of a natural progression or way of keeping up with modern gaming. But with the success of Expedition 33, do you think that possibly mainline Final Fantasy games could go back to being turn-based, as that seems to be something that players have an appetite for? With this question of turn-based versus action, it tends to isolate the gameplay to just the battle system. That doesn't take into account what kind of game the creators want to deliver to players. For example, based on certain graphical quality we want to present to our players or the narrative we want to deliver to our players, it relates to how we set up the game systems around it. This includes the battle system, game design, and gameplay feel. It's not a clear-cut answer whether it will become all turn-based or if it's going to become more action-based. I'm not necessarily going to be on Final Fantasy XVII, so we also don't want to obstruct or limit our future director or whomever will be producing the games like 17 or even 18. We don't want to put them on a rail. So I can definitely agree with Yoshida there, because you don't want to simply boil a game down to just the gameplay, right? Is it turn-based? Is it action combat? Like, that's not what's always the most important. For some people that is. Some people just care about the gameplay. They don't necessarily care about the characters or story as much. And I can definitely be that way sometimes depending on the game. But ultimately, games are more than that, right? And obviously, whatever vision like somebody has for the next Final Fantasy game, you don't want to limit it to a specific game style. Like, whatever vision they have for the game, like, let them make that product, right? Whether they want it to be action or turn-based. But also when it comes to something like Final Fantasy XVII, like, that game is potentially already decided in terms of, story, characters, gameplay, things like that, right? It really depends on when they actually started making the game, which we can't obviously know right now. Even though they're actually making the game currently, that's kind of hard to say, but possibly, right? 16's already 2 years old at this point. And if they already kind of decided on the combat of that game, it was before the explosion of, Expedition 33 and the success of that. Now, there's been popular turn-based RPGs before Expedition 33, right? And Square Enix themselves have been producing, turn-based RPGs for a while as well. Unless they're not that far into making the next Final Fantasy game, they can't just change the combat, right? But it just kind of depends on how far along they actually are on 17. That's just something we don't currently know. When it comes to the conversation of turn-based versus action and what do I want to see for the next Final Fantasy game, I don't give a shit. I like both, dude. It really doesn't matter to me. If I had a preference, it would probably be action RPG, just because that's what I'm used to these days. I've been playing a lot of. But if they drop the trailer tomorrow for Final Fantasy XVII and it's turn-based combat, I'm fine with it. I'm fully expecting Dragon Quest XII to be turn-based combat, right? The 9 remake, if it exists, to be turn-based combat, right? So, like, it's shit I like. I don't play, like, a ton of turn-based combat these days, but I can always go back and play, something like 7, 8, 9, and Final Fantasy X and have a great time. But I'm also not somebody that fully dictates whether or not I'm going to buy a game based on gameplay, right? Because there are people like that in this community. It's something I've been hearing for literally the last 10 fucking years now, since Remake was announced back in 2015. People that were not going to buy the game simply because it was action combat, right? Because it was not a turn-based remake of FF7, they're not going to buy it. And I still hear it to this fucking day. There was literally somebody that commented on a video within the last week or two complained about that. And it's like, goddamn, dude. You're missing out on a fantastic game just because you don't like the combat. Which is strange to me, because there's definitely games I've played that I don't necessarily like the gameplay, but I do like the characters and story. A recent example I can think of is like Death Stranding. It is a fun game overall, I would say. And it has its moments with the gameplay, but it's not like the most exciting game to play, right? The most exhilarating game to play. But the story itself was worth me continuing playing it, right? And there's a lot of times where I paused the story and went off and delivered shit for hours and built roads and all kinds of other things or whatever, right? Like, I had fun with the gameplay elements of it, but ultimately it was the story that was very, very captivating for me. It obviously took me a while to get around to playing Death Stranding, but if I dictated whether or not I was going to play that game simply because of the gameplay, I probably would have never played it. Ultimately, the point is I don't just limit myself to like one singular thing or reason for why I do or don't buy a game, right? And look, people are allowed to, not buy a game for whatever fucking reason they want, right? Whether it is, they don't like the gameplay or the characters, the story, whatever it might be. I just don't personally myself, rely only on that. Like, this is a Final Fantasy game. It's not turn-based. I'm not buying it because that's just ridiculous, because the story in most Final Fantasy games is still pretty damn good. As for the last bit of Yoshida's quote there, he says, I'm not necessarily going to be on 17, which is like a weird quote. Maybe he means like it's not confirmed whether he is or isn't, but like just either you are or you aren't, I guess. Whether or not Yoshida should make Final Fantasy 17, like, I don't know. Like, I like him overall. Like, I liked 16. I would want something different if he were to do the next Final Fantasy game. Something a little less action-oriented, right? Or incorporate more of what like 7 Remake does in terms of the combat, or again, like mini games and stuff to do in the world. It was literally just fight, story. That's all it was. There's no extra shit really that were at least fun to engage with in 16. So I'd want something more from a numbered entry from him. But also at the same time, my guy needs a break, dude. He's been doing Final Fantasy XIV for fucking ever at this point, and then eventually was making Final Fantasy 16 alongside 14. He also had some hand in the Fantasia Neo Dimension port, right? His studio is obviously working on the Tactics Remaster. It's rumored that his team is working on the 9 remake, right? And if he's also doing Final Fantasy 17, like, my god, when does he sleep? I said before that I would like to see Naoki Yamaguchi get his hand at a numbered entry at some point, whether that is 17 or 18 or something like that. Obviously, they're finishing up the remake trilogy currently for FF7, so when that would ever be, if he got a chance at that, I'm not entirely sure. But it's kind of the same conversation we had about the gameplay stuff or whatever previously. Like, I don't really give a shit which studio's making it or who's the director or whatever. As long as the game looks good, that's all that really matters. As for the Baldur's Gate 3 publishing director, he says, been playing a lot of OG Final Fantasy. And look, I'm not trying to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't like, but there's clearly the audience and desire for a more traditional Final Fantasy experience. There's at least 10 million units in it, less expensive with higher sales potential. He further adds, I think a genuinely 90 Metacritic turn-based Final Fantasy with an excellent original story and characters could pull 9 to 15 million in sales. You can make the combat system more dynamic, as has been done. That said, desire to build must lay with the developers themselves. I can certainly agree with him that there is demand for that, right? As I've mentioned earlier, I've been hearing this for the last decade now. And there's obviously a core audience of the Final Fantasy series that wants them to go back to the roots and everything like that. That's certainly true, all of that. Whether or not a turn-based traditional kind of Final Fantasy game would bring in 10 plus million units sold, I highly doubt that. It's just not that kind of franchise anymore. That's not what they do. It's what they have done in a long time, right? Like Final Fantasy 15 did that eventually. It took a while for them to get there. It took till like 2022, so about 6 years or so after release. But they did eventually get there. They got to 10 million, right? And where they are these days, I don't know. But and say what you will about 15, I do have my problems with it. I do like aspects of it. It did sell well. When it comes to like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was the next step into the action-oriented Final Fantasies, right? It eventually reached 7 million back in, I think, 2023 was like the last update we had. And where that is now, who knows exactly. I'm sure it'll eventually reach 10 million as well. We'll see how it does, I guess, on like Xbox and Switch, right? I guess more so we'll see how the game does on Switch too. I'm sure 7 Remake will hit 10 million eventually. As for Rebirth and 16, I'm not sure about that. Like, we haven't had updates on those or official updates on those in a long time, so who the fuck knows where those are at currently. Maybe they'll, hit 10 million 20 years from now. And like a turn-based Final Fantasy would bring in like 10 plus million units like easily, and I'm assuming this guy's talking in like the short term kind of. Like, I don't know. Would it eventually hit 10 million? Maybe. But like that's not really something the franchise does that much anymore, right? But again, I do agree that there's demand for that kind of a Final Fantasy game, and I just don't know how well it would do, because this is not what the franchise is anymore. It's this really old franchise at this point. They still produce great games, in my opinion. It's just not the kind of franchise that sells that well overall anymore, which is just super unfortunate. It's kind of on a decline too, right? Like 15 had a really good launch. So I think it's like 5 million day one or something like that, and then eventually hit 10 million. 7 Remake had a really good launch, like 3.5 million or something in the first day or two, and eventually hit 7 million, which obviously is less in case math is difficult. And then like Rebirth and 16 are kind of down here doing their own shit, right? And they're probably not reaching those numbers at all anytime soon. So it's like, what is Part 3 going to do? What is the next, Final Fantasy going to do? It's hard to really say. Now, there could be something in them going back to the roots, right? If their next Final Fantasy, like they're like, this is traditional, it's turn-based. It can still look really, really good, like 16 or 7 Remake, 7 Rebirth, right? It can still look like a modern Final Fantasy game, but maybe more traditional combat. And that might work if they campaign it right, they market it right. Maybe the franchise could use some sort of like a reset or some shit, right? I think of like Resident Evil, right? I'm thinking about that because I'm playing through Resident Evil 4 Remake right now. But obviously, like, the original 4 introduced like the more fast-paced action kind of combat, right? And then 5, took it a little further, and then 6 took it all the goddamn way. And then it's like, we need to reset this shit. They went back to the roots kind of with, Resident Evil 7 and so on and so forth. We are where we are right now with Resident Evil. And like, maybe Final Fantasy needs something like that, dude. I don't know. What I'm trying to say is I want a first-person survival horror Final Fantasy. But that's where we're going to wrap the video up here, my dudes. It's kind of a thicker video. We talked a lot about one particular subject, really, when it comes to the video. What are your thoughts overall? When it comes to the idea of them doing maybe turn-based combat for Final Fantasy 17 and or 18, which at this point, that's goddamn years away. What do you think? Do you care? Do you want more action Final Fantasy? Do you want more turn-based Final Fantasy? Do you want a more traditional Final Fantasy? You want them to continue doing what they're doing with, sort of 15, but like 16 and 7 Remake and shit? Like, what do you want from the franchise in the near future? That's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, _DaveYT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain or leave it like Cobain.